Now, because there's such a pressure for things to go out quickly, when people are reviewing cases, they want to get through those quickly themselves so they can get to their own caseload. So if your assessments aren't very high quality and to the point and accurate, a frustration builds internally within the department if you're consistently getting that wrong. So I felt that a bit, particularly in my early career where I was still learning. That was the hardest thing for me, was where other colleagues of mine thought I wasn't good. You know, you're protected externally from people by the organisation to certain degrees, but when you're kind of starting to get labelled internally as to someone who could be better, it's very hard to overcome that. So it can be quite a solitary place for an officer, particularly if they take things on personally like I did, and it can become quite solitary where you're asked to determine things on time by your manager, by applicants, and then lastly your colleagues don't actually think that your output's not very good. So that becomes quite a tough thing to manage. And if you want to learn more about the planning process and how you can unlock value out of any property, click the link below to learn more. So I was a planning officer for a few years. I wanted to give you my take on what it's like, just so you can maybe take something away from this to understand why the experience you're getting of the planning industry is as it is, and why, if you're thinking about going through the planning system or thinking about property investing, kind of gearing yourself up to understand the world that you're going to be working in once you start dealing with planning departments. So the first things to say is obviously there's budget cuts. Councils are on a shoestring budget. If they could employ more staff, they would. So with that being said, every planning officer is under a huge amount of work. They've got an immense amount of work. So when I was a planning officer, at my worst, I had over 100 cases, and it got to that point where I had too many cases going on. To be honest, I really valued the kind of work I was putting out. I really put a lot of pressure on myself to put the right stuff out. And when it got to 90 or 80 plus, really, I was dropping balls everywhere. I was making mistakes. I was doing misjudgments and things like that. And I was starting to kind of define myself as to this person who can't determine a planning application, just because I had too much work and I was put so much pressure on myself to do more and do better. But by trying to work harder, I basically got worse. So the mountain of work that a planning officer does is very, very high. And the difficult thing for a council is they have no carrot to dangle in front of them to incentivize them to work harder. They don't have the budget to incentivize them for more payments, and it's not like they can give them more time off or anything like that. There's very few benefits that a council can offer them. So it's a very, very hard situation to work through, where the demands on them are very, very high, but in actual fact what they can produce isn't nearly in line with demand. So councils being on a shoestring budget and officers on immense caseloads is a fact of what's going on. Now, the other hard truth of this is that if you type in the word planning officer into Google, a load of articles will come up about officers being bashed. They're not good enough, they're corrupt, they're incompetent, they're slow, I can't get hold of them, they don't determine my case on time, they won't listen to me. They are the focus of a lot of energy, and those are just the external influences. What I think people should understand is that internally there's a lot of pressure on them as well. So obviously, as an applicant, you want your application to be determined on time, so quite rightly you will try and get hold of them so that you can get an update on your case. But obviously, an officer has got over 100 cases, or could have over 100 cases. They don't have time to be picking up the phone to you, quite frankly. And again, being frank, is that because they've got so much work, they don't have time to be assessing a case in the early days. It's very likely they're going to be waiting to the last 2 weeks, maybe even a week of the deadline of a case, where they'll start assessing your case. So that's when you'll probably start getting contact from them. So there's a huge pressure on officers to deliver applications on time, but not only deliver them on time, obviously there's a pile that's constantly being put on by people, more applications coming in, so there's a pressure on them to pick them up. They're fair pressures, but it's just within the context of no budget and every officer having hundreds of them, you start to understand how that constant pressure on both ends starts to build. The other one is residents. So residents submit comments. More often than not, they're negative. So if a decision is made contrary to that resident's views, sometimes what can happen is that they think that the officers are in cahoots with either developers or that the council just simply doesn't listen to them and that they just make any decision they want, which is not true. Every case gets assessed on all the inputs of it, including residents' views. But a bit like an applicant can't get hold of an officer for an update on the application, the same thing goes with residents in terms of keeping them informed about how a case is going on. Another slight nuance to this is that internally, when an officer does their draft assessment, it needs to be reviewed. So either a manager or another senior member of staff will review it. Now, because there's such a pressure for things to go out quickly, when people are reviewing cases, they want to get through those quickly themselves so they can get to their own caseload. So if your assessments aren't very high quality and to the point and accurate, a frustration builds internally within a department if you're consistently getting that wrong. So I felt that a bit, particularly in my early career where I was still learning. That was the hardest thing for me, was where other colleagues of mine thought I wasn't good. You're protected externally from people by the organisation to certain degrees, but when you're kind of starting to get labelled internally as to someone who could be better, it's very hard to overcome that. So it can be quite a solitary place for an officer, particularly if they take things on personally like I did, and it can become quite solitary where you're asked to determine things on time by your manager, by applicants. You think you're not listening to residents don't think they're listening to you, and then lastly, your colleagues don't actually think that your output's not very good. So that becomes quite a tough thing to manage. So with all that being said, one of the biggest things I struggled with on a higher level is that planning departments are one of the biggest earners for councils. Planning application fees, Section 106, pre-application fees, what's called planning performance agreements, which are kind of pre-apps, but for really big schemes, they basically pay, they're just PPAs, they're kind of reserved for huge developments so that they can effectively pay for essentially a one-on-one service, but these are for like massive schemes. And still contributions as well, on top of the non-financial contributions, so things like affordable housing, or things like apprenticeships, or open space, green space, trees, sustainability measures, that kind of thing, and even quality of design, of course. So a huge amount of benefit is brought in by the council, by planning departments themselves, and I never understood that. But it was only when I left being a planning officer, and I had to get out. I was drowning, to be honest, and I was really struggling. I just had to get out of it. I mean, I learned so much in that time to this day, but I had to leave. It was not right for me mentally. It was only when I left did I realise that actually no one actually cares about what goes on in the planning department, and internally as well. So when you're in a planning department, there's a kind of tribal mentality where you're in it together, and everyone's kind of working through this single battle together. But when you get out of it, when people don't have that kind of interaction with the planning department or understand that nuance, they don't care, quite honestly. They just want the decisions made on time. And particularly if members want a certain benefit from a certain area or a certain development, they'll put pressure on the council or on the planning department to secure those benefits. And obviously, a development management team or planning team can only do so much. So it was a really interesting thing when I did that, when I stepped out and realised that no one cares about what goes on, when no one wants to care. They don't want to know what's going on. They don't want to know the struggles, because everyone in council is effectively struggling. So that's a nuance that I think people should understand, is that and if I can only do one thing, is to kind of raise the awareness of what goes on in the planning department, then I guess I've done a good job, just to kind of ease the kind of bashing that goes on for planning officers, because they're working within a system where they're doing their best. They're trying really hard, and it's not their fault, quite honestly. Planning officers are the scrutiny because they are the front line. They're the ones that deal with you, but they're working with their hands tied behind their backs, basically. So if you do get frustrated with the planning department, try and focus it elsewhere and work within what you have. Try not to focus on the planning officer. Now, everyone gets bad planning officers, I get that, and sometimes that's true, but I'm just saying that they're not always the problem. The system is, as everyone's saying at the moment, broken. It's in critical stage. The government have now released the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, was bill, now Act, which is going to bring in swathes of changes which may increase the output of planning departments, may help them out a lot. So we'll see where that goes, and that's likely to start happening in the beginning of 2024. But if you want to learn more about how to kind of unlock the value of a property through the planning system, and you want to prepare yourself about going through that process, click the link below to learn more, so that you can be one of the few that are kind of armed with all the tools that you need to get through the planning process, rather than being the one that goes in hot-handed, gets frustrated with the whole system, and then it actually gives up on the whole thing. So click the link below if you want to learn more.